Well, we want to turn to another important story, as I said at the outset of the show here. A lot of people wondering what's going to be happening with the new incoming Trump administration. U.S.-Mexico relations right at the heart of that. A number of different sort of war of words things have already happened, but could be leading up to some more serious moves by the U.S. government aimed against Mexico. As always, we are honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer, journalist for Jacobin Magazine, and also the host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast. Kurt, thank you as always for being with us.
Thanks very much, guys. Happy New Year.
Well, Happy New Year to you. Great to be joining you, Kurt, by the way, from America Mexicana. This is right. Our new country here. But, you know, it's I guess I kind of want to start there in a way, right? Because it almost feels like, you know, the bellicosity of Trump against any country in the world, that a lot of what he tries to do is just bully people in American politics as well into submission by having this sort of outsized thing. But I have to say, Claudia Sheinbaum has given as good as she's gotten, if not more. And from the very first sort of ridiculous set of taunting is not just throwing back haymakers, but laying out serious arguments in response. And to me, that just says something about the Fourth Transformation and the Fourth Transformation Project, that she is not rolling over. Mexico is not rolling over. They're saying, you want to come for us, we're going to stand up for our own people and what's right.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we saw this, first of all, when Trump initially threatened tariffs against Mexico, and President Sheinbaum came out with a very firm letter that actually got a lot of traction in the United States, which was great to see, right? Where she laid out that, you know, if you do tariffs, we'll have to do tariffs in response. We'll all lose. But remember, you know, the drug consumption problem is on your side, and we have to, you know, suffer from the weapons that come in from the U.S. to Mexico. And, you know, the dead bodies are ours, right? So, you know, Americans can be putting everything they want down their throats or up their nose, but it's the Mexicans that put the dead bodies in this, right? So I think that was a really good kind of opening salvo, in a good way, because as you saw, Trump shifted away from talking about Mexico after that letter and started attacking Canada in his really, you know, the classic bullying way. You know, Trudeau had his ridiculous moment of going down to Mar-a-Lago, you know, to try to, plead his case, you know, and a few weeks later, he's gone. He's out of office. And I think that was a really interesting contrast between, you know, the Canadian response, acting like a vassal state, basically, which is actually what López Obrador called them at one point, former Mexican President López Obrador, and the very firm response by Claudia Sheinbaum. Now, a few weeks later, Trump is back at it again with this whole idea that Mexico is run by the cartels, and he's going to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to just stupid stuff, Gulf of America, just to try to grab headlines and blah, blah, blah. So how do you respond to something like that? Do you get angry? Do you, respond kind of, viscerally, which is exactly what he wants? Or do you do what President Sheinbaum did again, yesterday? Break out the map. This is where Mexico was before. America Mexicana's got a great ring to it. Why not go back?
I mean, I laughed out loud for real when I saw that clip. I mean, even CNN enjoyed it, by the way. You know how the mainstream media is not huge fans of the Morena party in Mexico, but even they were like, oh, watch her, take a dig at Trump. All that's to say, we do have this incoming Trump administration, Kurt, and there are apparently plans to invade Mexico. We've heard in recent years the right-wing, the Republican Party, very important members in the Republican Party advocate for even bombing Mexico. Of course, they use the drug cartels as a reason for doing that. They throw in China and fentanyl factories, and other mainstream liberal outlets have played into these fantasies as well, like the New York Times. So I'm just curious, as we await the Trump administration to enter office, what are the expectations here of what could take place? Because it kind of seems like they're pretty set on some sort of U.S. aggression towards Mexico, invoking the drug cartels as the reason, but we know there's like actual reasons behind it that have nothing to do with that.
Sure. So, I think we have to always work to separate the rhetoric from the reality with Trump, right? Because Trump tries to intimidate with this whole kind of constant verborrea, like they say in Spanish, the constant verbiage, right? So it's all, Canada and then Greenland and then the Panama Canal and then this and that, let's remember, this is not the United States that it was even in Trump's first term. This is the United States. It's in a much more multilateral world. This is the United States, which is, within its proxy wars in Ukraine, its genocide in Gaza. It's trying to provoke a war with China, within the next couple of years. It's loaded its government with China hawks, right? It's a government that's it's a country that's much more indebted, and a whole series of things. Obviously, the small reputation the United States had left on the world scale is gone because of Gaza, right? So, this idea that they can just, in such cavalier fashion, go in and invade Mexico doesn't really correspond to the reality, despite the wet dreams of some of the Trumpers, right? I think they'll realize that they're dealing in Mexico now with a very unified society against any kind of U.S. aggression. Claudia Sheinbaum has a 78% approval rating in the latest polls, compared to, the U.S., where half of the country hates Trump, or Canada, which just, ejected Trudeau. Mexico's in a very different situation now. Now, that's not to say that the U.S. may very well not try something. And it's very worrying that the new the new U.S. ambassador in Mexico, who's going to be replacing Ken Salazar, is Ron Johnson, a former Green Beret. And we know the Green Berets, they specialize in covert ops, right? And also a former CIA spook, right? So Ron Johnson was very active in the El Salvador Civil War back in the late 70s and early 80s, when the U.S. was arming, financing, and training death squads in El Salvador to terrorize, torture, mutilate, and disappear the Salvadorian population. And all those people were trained up at Fort Benning at the School of the Americas, right? And then he went on, he went on to Panama in the Noriega years. In the CIA, he was over helping to break up Yugoslavia. So, Ron Johnson is a very clear destabilizing factor. And I said very clearly Mexico should reject his credentials. They very likely won't, but they should. And so he's going to be there in this new embassy building, the largest embassy building in the world now in Mexico City. And that's obviously clearly a worrying factor. While I don't see, U.S. troops crossing the border or anything, like that, I see very likely the possibility of, covert ops, sending in special forces, kidnapping Mexican citizens, always with the pretext that they're, terrorists, because they want to declare the cartels foreign terrorist organization, always with the pretext that they're cartel members and they're narcos and this and that. But once they start kidnapping Mexican citizens, where do they stop? Could they then just kidnap uncomfortable journalists? Could they kidnap activists? Could they then kidnap politicians, even politicians in office? Remember that the U.S. press during the presidential campaign this year was trying to drum up a false story that López Obrador was tied to the drug cartels, right? And that involved ProPublica and the New York Times and all this. They had no evidence to it. But, just on that basis alone, you could see some wayward Trump, bureaucrats, trying to, whip up some kind of kidnap plot, right? And we know that the United States does this because we know their whole third country rendition program that existed for years, going back to Clinton and Obama, going into countries, claiming people are terrorists, whisking them out of the country, and then taking them to third countries or Guantanamo, where they languish for up to decades, and then, in many cases have to be released for lack of evidence, right? So this is what is more worrying to me. Not that there's going to be a full frontal invasion, but that they could, try to send in special ops teams in coordination with Ron Johnson over at the embassy, and violate Mexican sovereignty up and down. And I think that could lead to a very slippery slope.
No, I think that's a great point. And, listen, it's why it's great to have you here and why it's great to have your articles and the podcast that you also do, because, the manufacturing consent element of this feels so important in the regards of what you're saying to these sort of, what they call gray zone type actions. Obviously, there was the New York Times fentanyl thing, which you previously had mentioned about the drug cartels. One thing I'll add to that, even though not everyone has seen this because it's on Paramount Plus, but this show Lioness with Zoe Saldana, which is, obviously she's huge. Morgan Freeman's in the show. The whole second season is just U.S. special ops into Mexico under the guise that Mexico is controlled by cartels. Now, of course, people can say that's fiction, but you start to put all these things together. The way this sort of and who knows what's happening behind the scenes and who's paying for this, all these different sorts of things. But it just seems like the manufacturing consent element of this in like the quote unquote liberal media, liberal Hollywood has an extra pernicious effect, because I think a lot of progressive, liberal-minded people are excited about what's happening in Mexico. So if you can kind of put that kind of creeping doubt in their minds, it plays an important role in pushing these sorts of policies, even under someone like Trump.
I think it absolutely does, right? Because as we've seen across, Latin America, there's always been the attempt to use, drug trafficking and narco trafficking as a way to destabilize any government that just has a whiff of progressivism about it. They tried narco AMLO last year, just like they tried to use narco Evo before. It's the same playbook. It's the same exact playbook, and they'll try it again and again. And we just saw, you mentioned this New York Times piece on fentanyl. There is no balder example of trying to manufacture consent than that most recent New York Times piece by Natalie Kitreff and Paulina Villegas. There's no balder example, right? They go in and they claim that they're, going into Culiacan, Sinaloa, and they're in a fentanyl lab. First of all, I had a string on this on Twitter that happened to go viral. First of all, the whole piece is what I call is written with this kind of obnoxious protagonism of putting themselves in the center of the piece, right? We did this. We went in. We put on hazmat suits. We had to wait in the hotel until the time was right. We were hearing shots outside, right? Then, at the end, we had to grab our phones and run out. Like it was some kind of cheesy Netflix script instead of serious, serious journalism with, backing up your claims, right? I called it on our podcast a kind of a narco tourism porn, right? Where somebody from rich countries can go in, whip themselves up and to be the center of the story and try to pass off something that is very unlikely. What they tried to pass off is that these people were cooking what was supposedly fentanyl with no protection whatsoever, with no protective equipment, no masks, knowing how toxic the fumes are for that would knock you out in a question of minutes. But they would have you believe that just with a bandana, that they were, they had developed an immunity to this, some kind of magical immunity to this. Now, if you're going to make such a fantastic claim, you have to back it up somehow. Back up that that's actually humanly possible, right? Because earlier in the piece, they had said that the lab they had been working in originally had been raided, so they had to kind of improvise a lab just in a kitchen. And this, provoked all kinds of laughter and memes in Mexico, that they're, in a kitchen with hot sauce and open beer cans, and they're, cooking something up that looked like atole, the classic Mexican drink, So people in Mexico are like, watch out, my grandmother's making pozole out on the porch. The New York Times is going to come and raid us, Oh, my grandmother's whipping up something for New Year's. Oh, here comes the New York Times in their suits, right? I shared a clip from E.T., kind of in that same vein, that scene in E.T. when they kind of go in the house with their suits on, kind of, right? So that's like, it's funny, but it's really very colonial, isn't it? This idea of rich person journalists or rich country journalists coming in with their, hazmat suits into a Mexican kitchen and trying to make a me show out of it, and trying to claim that something's happening that may very well have not been happening. Because the precursor chemicals that they mention in the piece are the same precursor chemicals that you can use to make meth, for example. So was it a meth lab, right? That's the question. And so I put in the string, just to conclude on this, we've been here before. There's Jayson Blair. There's Judith Miller with WMD. There's Anat Schwartz with the October 7th rape stories, right? Is this another one of those? Looks damn well like it is, right? They're trying to manufacture consent, making up a story about fentanyl to, open the door to a Trump administration intervention. Because if it's that easy to make fentanyl, anybody in any kitchen anywhere can make it. So what's the need to then point the finger at Mexico?
Mm.
The story kind of nullifies itself in that respect.
Yeah, it's really incredible the way that works. Real quick, Kurt, before I have to wrap with you here, I wanted to also ask you. I mean, all this is happening as Mexico has this new leader, Claudia Sheinbaum. It's so historic, this woman president of this massive country. I'm just curious. She's been in office for less than a year now, and how it seems like she's, it seems like she's done at least she's quite popular so far in Mexico. And I'm just curious how it's going with the sort of progressive agenda that she wanted to continue after AMLO.
It's going well. I mentioned earlier on that she has that very high approval rating. She's going to be celebrating her 100 days in the Zocalo of Mexico City coming up in a few days. Claudia Sheinbaum said very clearly that she wants to build the second floor on the fourth transformation. So there were all these people who said, oh, you have to make a clean break with AMLO and show you're your own person. And she said, no, we're part of a movement here, and this is going to be a continuation of a movement, but with, my own accent on things. So just for example, Lopez Obrador, rolled out the 65 and over universal senior pension. Claudia Sheinbaum is going to drop that down to 60 for women, and that's already underway. So now women who are 63 and 64 can get their cards and start, collecting on their pension, right? She's also rolled out a program for door-to-door healthcare, right? Which is, we go to door-to-door to see what you need, right? Especially for senior citizens. A lot of times we're shut in or can't get out or don't even know that they have healthcare options. So that's been another one of her early rollouts. They're also working on building 2 new train lines from Mexico City up to the U.S. border, one to Nogales, one to Nuevo Laredo. They want to build a Mexican electric car with Mexico's own lithium, of course. Put a satellite into space. So, this is not your mother's Mexico in that sense. It's like, it's a different country in that sense. And it's interesting that I think the U.S. population, because I think of Sheinbaum's the letter and her response in America Mexicana, are finally kind of realizing that something interesting is going on down here. A little late, but it's good to see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, listen, if you're watching this and wondering how you know more about Mexico, follow Kurt Hackbarth on Twitter. Follow his byline at Jacobin Magazine and the Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast is a must listen. Kurt, thank you as always for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much, guys.